Welcome to the FLOA protocol. I'm Dr. Jones, DC. Lose the extra body weight, but finally keep it off for the rest of your life, guys. I'm very excited that you're watching part one of a 3-video series. I know it's a lot of information, guys, but what we're doing is very unique, and I want you guys to have a comprehensive understanding of the wildly successful program that I've been doing for the last 20 years. This has been my life's work. I'm gonna get into a deep aspect of my prior history here and what led to the cultivation of this program. Let's just dive right in, guys. Part one, how it all started and what am I up against? What we will cover today. We're gonna talk about my backstory. We're gonna get into the history, and we're gonna let history tell the story of obesity and difficulties with sustainable weight loss, where it all came from. Are you dealt a bad hand? What do my genetics mean? My concerns over GLP-1 medications, that's Tirzepatide, Semaglutide, Ozempic, Wegovi, Mounjaro. And then we're gonna talk about the lack of practical, sustainable approaches for weight loss on the market. Okay, so who am I? Whew. Well, this is a deep story, guys, and so I'm happy to share it because this really was the starting point of why I'm so passionate about fighting obesity. So my weight loss struggles started in middle school. Up into middle school, weight was completely average, felt like a completely normal kid, no issues at all. And I remember about middle school is when I first started noticing that I was overweight, that I was different than the other kids. I mean, it bothered me. It bothered me from day one. I'm not sure exactly why, but it did. And it seemed every year I just continued to gain more and more weight, and I continued to be impacted emotionally, and my confidence, which was never an issue in the past, just began to decrease and decrease and decrease over time. Then I hit high school, and it seemed like the bullying and the lack of acceptance from everybody else, which ultimately was my decision. That, you know, looking back, there was plenty of other overweight kids that were very popular. So this was a me issue. I chose to not handle my weight. I let it affect me negatively. So I hit 16 years old. By the way, the irony here is I have very healthy parents. My mom was overweight as a child, so I do know and we're gonna talk about genetics here in a little bit, but my dad is very fit. He's never been overweight himself. So they were trying their best to encourage exercise, to encourage healthier choices, but it's hard. You know, in this day and age, your kid goes to school. I was going to school, I was eating the crap food at the school, and you know, lunch was the part of the day that I looked forward to, that made me feel good. And now I understand that that's because the addictive chemicals that are in the toxic food that we're feeding our kids and that we're eating, you know, some of us every day still. So pretty horrible. So I remember I went to the gym. I did go to the gym. I still worked out. Not that I had a plan of attack with my workouts. It was just kind of, you know, from sports, or my parents told me to work out, so I still worked out, but that didn't stop my inevitable weight gain. And I remember the day, and I weighed myself because I think deep down, part of me wanted to do something, even though I felt like there was no motion at all happening. There was no starting point to this. And then I hit 300 pounds. I remember the scale. I can see it right now in the locker room of that La Puente Hills 24-hour fitness in Southern California. It's where I grew up. And it broke 300. And you know, when I saw that, I remember getting off the scale and jumping back on. I mean, mind you, last time I weighed myself, it was like 295. So I'm not sure what was, I think there was just something about 300, you know, those scales that you have to move that thing up top, the bigger increment of weight. And I remember second time I weighed myself and I was in disbelief, and a wave of emotion came over me. It was not cool. It was very sad. And then it seemed like you know, cause I'd never hit 300, and all of a sudden, you know, I'm going home that day, and that emotion, you know, turned into anger, and then that anger turned into action, right? Because I start thinking like, I'm actually, for whatever reason, it took me that point to click, but I'm hitting a point of no return. So I finally just took action, and I ended up hiring a trainer. I didn't have money, so I had saved up enough for 5 personal training sessions. I found a personal trainer who had pre and post pictures. Something about somebody who's already lost over 100 pounds that I wanted to work with. Told him this is all I got. I was like, can you give me a battle plan? You know, and he taught me the battle plan, which is completely outdated model, and you know, it's funny how it led to where I'm at now. But essentially, I lost 100 pounds by doing lots of cardio, lots of resistance training, eating 6 small meals throughout the day, and counting my calories and portioning it all out. So I lost the 100 pounds and it transformed my life. Unfortunately, I found out a year later that I couldn't maintain the weight off. I zigzagged. I didn't zigzag and regain the 100 pounds, but it seems like every year that, because I was 16 years old, 17, barely starting college, and it seemed like I couldn't keep the weight off and I would regain about 50 pounds every single year. And this kept happening. Winter would start, I regained the weight because summer's over, I don't care as much, right? And then it seems like January would come around and I'm like thinking about summertime and being shirtless at pools at that young age, right? Because that mattered so much to me. Then I would go on the same unsustainable approach and get really serious about it and get to summer break and then lose it again. And then I remember finding intermittent fasting. So this was such a crazy concept at the time, early 20s now. I actually let it sit with me for about a year before I finally started doing intermittent fasting, because I was like thinking I'm gonna lose muscle mass. It goes against, anytime it's called a stable datum and it clashes with your existing datum in your mind, right? So this was a huge clash and essentially invalidated a lot of ideas and concepts and conclusions that I had. But I did it, and lo and behold, I noticed immediate improvements in my ability to maintain weight. It wasn't the solution, but it seemed like I'm zigzagging about 20 pounds a year. And then I finally, prolonged fasting, which was not too wild to me. I mean, it's wild, right? Fasting for more than a day, but at this point, it was a bigger leap for me to go from 6 meals to the intermittent. My mind was like, let's do it. Let's go for it, baby. And then once I got into a rhythm of prolonged fasting, I kept pushing it. Some of the best fasting experts, even today, will say a 2 to 3 day fast. The most I ever hear experts talk about is fasting experts a couple times a year. And I found myself doing it at least once a month and then playing around with different versions of it. So that was my ticket to maintaining a healthy weight and doing it in a manner that my whole life didn't revolve around being fit. Because again, as you remember from my story, I can do it in the past, but I couldn't, it wasn't sustainable. I didn't desire to do that year round, right? So now I'm healthy. Now I'm at the level that I want to stay. I become a doctor of chiropractic. I focus on functional medicine. So I'm working with patients over the last decade and doing a lot of prolonged fasting with my patients. And this is when I started to learn so much more that prolonged fasting does. And we're going to talk about that in my part 2 webinar, The Science of Prolonged Fasting. But I noticed the huge decreases in inflammation, and inflammation's basically at the starting point of almost every disease process that begins. And so, in my opinion, there is no functional optimization program that doesn't involve at least some intermittent fasting. But for most of us, prolonged fasting is necessary because we have extra body weight that we need to lose, impairing us from optimal health. But I would say the difficulty level of starting prolonged fasting was a huge roadblock for most people. Now we fast forward to these GLP-1 medications and then some peptide therapy. We're going to talk about those, AOD 9604, but the combination of both peptides, boom, that was the answer for my patients, and we haven't turned back. The success for this program has been very, very much more so than I would have ever anticipated, and I think we're really on to something. I feel like what I've created is the intermittent fasting, the 16-8, right? The 16-8 is the most standardly accepted intermittent fasting protocol. I feel like I created that in the prolonged fasting regimen because it gives structure where structure was lacking. All right. So let history tell the story. So it's pretty fascinating if you ask your grandparents what they used to do prior to the 50s to treat obesity, and you might be surprised to hear that they did a low-carb diet. It was well understood for about 100 years prior to 1950, that prior century, that processed refined carbohydrate excess in consumption led to weight gain, and so the decrease in that would cause weight loss, right? And then something happened very interesting in the 1950s. We noticed a pretty big increase, a marked increase in death by heart attacks. So naturally, we're trying to figure out what the heck is going on and what's causing this. Little did we know that improvements in modern medicine between antibiotics, vaccines, and just public health measures, we were no longer dying nearly as much to things like common infections like tuberculosis, for example. So death by infection markedly decreased due to advancements in science. And so by default, the next thing in line to kill us, naturally, is heart attacks. But we didn't draw that conclusion, unfortunately. And so fat due to some faulty research and its connection to cholesterol and the connection between cholesterol and heart disease. Again, not really solid and sound behind the literature, but we needed something to blame, right? There's always got to be a villain. So between the 50s and 70s ensued this massive debate between, the experts in the field, and something pretty crazy happened. For the first time in history, in 1977, the government stepped in. By the way, not by any sound advancement in the literature. It'd be one thing if we had at least, maybe faulty, but at least some sort of big study so that the government can say, here's the reason, it's conclusive, I gotta make a decision. No, there was nothing. It was just the government saying, this is what we gotta do. First time Big Brother has ever stepped in and made a health decision for us. And so from that day, after Congress decided that fat was the enemy, started the massive campaign, not just initially in America, but ultimately the rest of the world followed, where we villainized fat, so we made a massive attempt to decrease fat intake. Well, by decreasing fat intake, we have to increase carbohydrate intake because there's only three sources of calories: protein, fat, and carbohydrates. So if you are going to decrease fat, which is the most dense form of calories, you are inevitably going to increase carbohydrates. It's pretty interesting, and my belief is there was some cognitive dissonance there that took place because we knew carbohydrates were bad in the past. So how can we make sense of carbohydrates being now okay? Well, if you notice, our whole efforts to treat obesity have been caloric based. And so we thought it was fat and calories that were the culprit, not so much carbohydrates. So from that point on, the food pyramid that we all probably remember growing up as a kid, nice 6 to 8 servings of whole grains and whole wheats and a 60% carbohydrate based diet. And you know what's pretty wild? If you look at this chart here and you look at the rates of obesity, look at 1977, you could see a marked increase in obesity the very year that we made a massive shift into a carbohydrate-rich diet. Also, too, they pushed snacking as well. And we're gonna talk about the combination of both increased carbohydrates and snacking, eating more often. Even if your calories are the same, snacking is a problem. We're gonna get into that in part 2 when we dive into the science of obesity. So, am I dealt a bad hand? What do my genetics mean? This whole nature versus nurture debate is very fascinating. And being a holistic practitioner myself, our company's mission statement has always been reducing prescriptions, preventing surgeries, restoring optimal health. So at the basis of almost every type of service that we do is some lifestyle intervention. And so it's tough for obese individuals in this society because there's so much shame and there's a lot of, well, you're just lazy, you just eat uncontrollably. Even doctors too would blame the patients. And that's just not the case. And I'm gonna go over here a couple of different reasons why I feel that way. But obesity is heavily genetic based. So let's dive into it. So the first study was done, it was a Danish study because they did keep really good logs of their adoptive records. And so what they first looked at was these adoptive kids, and they were looking at the incidences of the correlation of obesity between a child and their non-biological parent, their adoptive parent. And this would prove some sort of environmental relationship. And there was no environmental relationship that existed at all. Then they took those same kids and looked at the biological parents, which they were not raised with and had no connection with whatsoever, and showed the complete opposite, a strong correlation. Then there was another study done where they essentially took identical and fraternal twins and compared them both to biological and adoptive parents, just to again get a little bit of an increased look at the same aspects that the Danish study was looking at, and they concluded the same thing, but with an ability to accurately pinpoint about 70% of your obesity basis from genetics, okay? Not 100%, right? So if you remember at January 1st, 2023, this very year, if you're watching it this year, there was that episode of 60 Minutes, and this so-called obese expert came on a show that's supposed to be very much unbiased and actually giving us both sides of the story. And if you ask my opinion, that episode looked like a commercial for Wegovi from Big Pharma. But anyways, she made it seem like obesity is 100% genetics and completely out of your control. So where we land, in our opinion, and this is important because it also relates to the development of our program, is that it's 70% genetics. And so what that translates to is that you're gonna have to work a lot harder than everybody else who doesn't have genetic-based obesity. But that doesn't mean it's completely out of your control. You can take action, but you're just gonna have to work a lot harder in this particular category of your life. Woe is me, forget about it. Let's focus on a plan of action. And we're gonna get to that in later webinars. Okay, so let's talk about my concerns over GLP-1 usage long-term. So first of all, it's not ideal from just a simplistic viewpoint. If we're talking about optimal health, it's not optimal to need a medication for the rest of your life. Now, simply put, medications are foreign to the body and medications cause damage long-term. It's difficult to measure that damage, it's difficult to quantify it, which is why a lot of people say there's no damage, but that is a very heated and controversial discussion for a later date. I can tell you in my opinion that medications do come at a cost because they're toxic and foreign to the body. So these medications do require long-term consistency in usage in order to maintain the results. There's also no long-term safety studies. Now, this is very much confusing for a lot of patients because GLP-1s have been around for decades. The earlier versions before Ozempic required daily injections. And Ozempic, which was FDA approved in 2017, was the first of its kind to only require a weekly injection. It was altered more to make it more potent, and in my opinion, alters the effect on the body and might as well be called a different class of medications, but by definition, they call it the same. So I think we're gonna see over time more and more consequences. Here's an example of what I just caught wind of a couple weeks ago. The Society of Anesthesiologists have updated their recommendations for elective surgeries, recommending that you as a patient stop your GLP-1 medication usage 2 weeks prior to a surgery that requires anesthesia. Well, 50% of deaths happen from anesthesia from food that's in your tract stomach that makes it up through your throat and down your trachea, essentially your breathing tube. It gets stuck and can cause an infection. So this is why they're very, very emphatic, at least the surgeries I've had, about recommending no food, no water the whole night before. But the problem is GLP-1 medications slow down the GI transit. And so even when you have a longer period of time of not eating before your surgery, you can still have something stuck. And so you therefore can have a greater chance of food coming up and killing you. What about all the surgeries that are not elective? What if you're in a car accident? What if you have some sort of major trauma and you gotta be rushed to the hospital and you're on this medication for life? Now you have to have a greater risk of death every single time. I can't tell you what percentage of increase is, but I can tell you that's not something that should be taken lightly in my opinion. And I think this is just one of many signs that we're gonna see as more and more time passes about the potential risks of long-term use of these medications. So we talked about the lack of long-term safety studies. What we know right off the get-go is these medications can cause pancreatitis. We do regular routine blood work with our patients, and so we see it all the time where we have to remove them because their pancreatic enzymes are elevated. And pancreatitis, by the way, is not an organ that you want to take lightly if it gets inflamed. Itis means inflammation because it can kill you rather fast. We know that this medication caused some rare thyroid medullary carcinomas, cancers in the rodent model, and so it's very unlikely to transfer to human beings, but still, that's an inherent risk that long-term usage is going to be substantially worse for. So, and then we already mentioned the literature shows that when you stop the medications, you're going to regain the weight back. So with all that being said, you might think that, is he recommending this medication or not? I am, but I'm recommending it for short-term use only. I am very concerned about anybody having to take this medication long-term. Now, let me just say, if you are an individual whose best case scenario is to be on this medication for the rest of your life, then I am not shaming you in any way, shape, or form because this is still going to provide a better scenario. But for the rest of us, I want to provide, and for all of us, I want to provide an opportunity for you to at least see if you can do what we're doing with our patients, whether you do it on your own or whether you do it with us, and successfully lose your weight and wean off the medications, because that's what I think needs to be done here. You need to have a plan of attack so that you can implement your weight loss, get off the medications, and maintain it for the rest of your life. That's how we limit our risks of all these potential concerns that I have over the long-term usage. Now, side note, completely irrelevant of your health is the financial aspect, right? These are very expensive medications, anywhere between $1,000 to $1,500 a month. It's all fine and dandy when you're paying 20 bucks as a copay because your insurance covers it. But what's gonna happen if, say, you lost your insurance? What if your insurance company stops paying it? I see it all the time. People can't even get Wegovi covered as it is. Whether that changes in the future or not, it's not a stable environment in terms of insurance covered medications. It's constantly changing all the time. Are you prepared if you are somebody who's thinking about doing this medication long term to pay for it for the rest of your life? Probably not, because you're here watching my webinar, but I just, if you've wondered it in the back of your mind, let that marinate for a little bit and tell me what you think. Okay, so there are a lack of practical approaches towards sustainable weight loss on the market. So the old school method, the counting calories, counting macros, this is what I did. This is tough. This is very unsustainable, right? What do I mean by sustainable weight loss? What we have to understand is that if we lose weight, we can't just go back to our old ways and expect to keep the weight off for the rest of our life. I know we all love that. And the day that that medication was ever, released, that we could do that, you're probably gonna find out later how rapidly horrible it is for you in other aspects. You gotta make some changes in the post-weight loss phase and carry those over to the rest of your life. Like, there's gotta be some sustainability component to it. And if I look at all methods on the market, what I noticed, and I've gone through a lot of them, is they're not practically sustainable. They're hard to incorporate. Counting calories and macros and portioning out 6 meals a day, that's a lot of effort. It is a lot of time. It is very boring. It is very frustrating. I hated it and I didn't do it. I couldn't keep up with it. I would do it just for those 3 months when I was getting super hardcore and super fixated, and then I would fall off the bandwagon. So the solution to that are programs like Jenny Craig and Nutrisystem. And while these are attempting to take the difficulty out of it for you, you're still stuck with this, like, am I gonna be ordering food from this company for the rest of my life? That's not practical. There's so much yummy, delicious food. And if we really look at our culture, food is a big part of our culture. Look at all the holidays. You're not going to be bringing your Jenny Craig and your Nutrisystem to your family, Christmas shindig. Like, it's just not going to happen. So the HCG diet, man, this one blows my mind that people still utilize this. I think they just had a really good marketing plan from the get-go. But HCG is a fertility hormone. It has no ramification or bearing over anything in the metabolic system or calories or suppressing hunger or anything. There was a study that showed some fat loss. I think because of the potential for HCG to increase testosterone, that's maybe what they noticed. It's a very weak program, and in my opinion, all the weight loss comes from because it puts you on a 500 caloric intake per day, right? 500 calories per day. And everybody hits a plateau within a couple weeks or a month, and then they regain all their weight back because 500 calories a day, like, where do you go from there? It's very, very unsustainable and very challenging even to make it. And then finally, we have one of my favorites out of the programs that I've seen that are popular is the Keto Atkins. What's going on there? There's something there. It has to do with metabolic flexibility, and we'll talk about it later. But what happened if you are somebody who went on the Atkins diet? You probably gained it all back because you're sitting here watching this video. And that's just more of that practical sustainability aspect. I think the keto diet, which is the new version of Atkins, is very healthy for you. And if you are the couple percentage points of people that don't have any issue with it and love it, and it doesn't affect you emotionally, watching everybody eat carbs, then go for it. But for most people, it wasn't practically sustainable, and so they gained all their weight back. Okay, so this is the end of part 1 of the 3-part series. So I hope you guys have a good understanding now of what you're up against, what led you to this point of obesity. Our next webinar is going to talk about the science of obesity and the science of our solution. And then the third video is going to be what's the program. So I did my best to separate it for you guys so that you can skip forward to whatever one. Hopefully you watch them all in order, but I'll leave that up to you guys, and we'll see you on part 2.